Hello, my name is Simonize, and welcome to another Simonize Guide video. Unlike some other classes, there's not one cookie-cutter build for rogues that is just the best build. There are actually quite a few that are very good in different circumstances. In this video, we're going to go over 4 PvE rogue talent specializations, some variations of each one, and talk about what each specialization is used for. Let's get started with some more normal specializations like combat and assassination, and then we'll talk about some more niche specializations. Also, we're going to give some fun names to the niche specializations to make it easier to refer to them. First, we're looking at standard assassination, seen on the screen here. This is your basic assassination Mutilate spec with very strong sustained damage output. You've probably seen some players using a variant of this talent specialization, opting for 18 points in combat to pick up lightning reflexes, and only 2 points in subtlety instead of the standard 13-7 spread. So which version of assassination is better? Currently, both the simulator tool at wowsims.github as well as my spreadsheet put these two versions of assassination within less than 1% difference across many different gear and fight settings, with a slight preference towards the 13-7 with shorter fight lengths. So what this means is that you just play whichever you're more comfortable with. Personally, I like the much more predictable energy generation of the standard 13-7 spec, so that's what I usually use. If you want to apply exposed armor with this specialization, you'll want to drop 2 points out of lethality and take the improved exposed armor talent. Don't use the exposed armor glyph in this case. I'm not going to go into whether you or someone else should be doing expose or sunder here. That's a whole other video. Just know that if you want to be applying exposed armor with assassination, you want to drop 2 points out of lethality and take 2 points in improved exposed armor. If you're interested in some rotation advice for how to play assassination, I've linked my rotation guide video in the description of this video, so you can scroll down and check that out. Another common question about assassination is, when does combat become better? Many people have this idea that in Wrath, you should start out as assassination, and then at some particular gear level, you should switch to combat. As far as I can tell, that's just not true. That was common knowledge before Wrath Classic came out, and it was also common knowledge that assassination would be vastly superior to combat in Phase 1. And now we have actual raid data that shows assassination and combat are both very close in performance. My spreadsheet predicts in the future that assassination will be ahead of combat by about 1 to 3% in Phases 1, 2, and 3, and combat ahead by less than 1% with Phase 4 best in slot gear. When should you switch to combat? Well, right now if you want to. Or stay assassination the entire game. They're both very strong specializations, and both can perform better than the majority of other DPS classes. There's no specific time or specific gear level where you're supposed to switch to combat. Speaking of combat, let's move on to looking at standard combat talent specialization. For this spec, you can use one of any of the weapon specialization talents: close quarters combats for fists and daggers, hack and slash for axes and swords, or mace specialization for maces. You'll want to use 2 weapons that both match one of those talents. There's not such a massive difference in the power of the talents that it forces you into those weapon types. Rather, you pick your strongest weapons, and then you take whatever the corresponding talent is. Most raids will want to have at least one combat rogue for the Savage Combat physical damage debuff. The only other class that can apply this is Arms Warrior, and we all know the state of warriors right now. It's definitely preferred to have a combat rogue over an arms warrior. While the glyphs for assassination are pretty set in stone, combat glyphs are much more variable, as there are a variety of competing options that you might use in different circumstances. Glyph of Killing Spree is one of the highest value glyphs if your boss kill times mean the glyph would give you at least 1 extra use of Killing Spree. Anything under 75 seconds means no extra uses, and the range from about 125 seconds to about 160 seconds also means no extra uses. All other kill times, and this glyph is excellent. Glyph of Tricks of the Trade is a great boost to one of your best abilities, giving more time for threat transfer and for the damage buff of Tricks of the Trade. It's generally one of the best glyphs for overall team contribution, but does not help your individual damage output. You're using this glyph and you're buffing someone else's damage. Glyph of Exposed Armor should be used if you intend on applying exposed armor for your raid. Unlike assassination, you don't want to have improved exposed armor talent as combat, and you do want the glyph. Glyph of Fan of Knives is of course a great choice if you care about AoE damage, giving a big boost to Fan of Knives damage. This is a more viable choice as combat than it is for assassination, since the single target glyphs for combat are much less significant than they are for assassination. Glyph of Adrenaline Rush, Rupture, and Sinister Strike are your basic damage glyphs. None of them are a huge deal, which is why there's variability in combat glyph choice. Adrenaline Rush is a strong choice that is very easy to gain damage from. Sinister Strike is also a decent choice, but the RNG element of the combo point generation makes it difficult to plan and predict your ability usage, so you sometimes spend those combo points inefficiently. So we've covered the basic 2 standard specializations. Let's get into some interesting specializations for more niche purposes. First, let's talk about 38-33-0, sometimes referred to as Hybrid or AoE Spec. I'm going to call it Fish Spec, so we can be very clear. We're going to give animal names to each of these specs. The Fish Spec is a fully dedicated AoE damage specialization. Its single target output is really poor, around a 10 to 12% loss compared to standard combat or assassination, but its AoE capability is phenomenal. The unique thing about rogue AoE damage compared to other classes is that rogue AoE damage scales up with the number of targets. Suppose if a warlock is using Seed of Corruption and goes from attacking 5 enemies to attacking 10 enemies, they double their damage output. If a rogue casting Fan with this spec goes from 5 enemies to 10 enemies, they more than double their damage output. If your raid does large pulls of enemies, you might consider having this as your secondary specialization and switching into it for those large pulls. There are quite a few unexpected items that are very good for Rogue's AoE damage output regardless of the spec being used, and I want to mention what I consider the top 3 special AoE items you can get. Titansteel Spellblade is surely the most peculiar and also the most powerful. Spellblade is good specifically because of its slow weapon speed and dagger weapon type. The spell power on it does nothing for rogues. Fan of Knives damage calculation is what is called non-normalized. Having a non-normalized ability means that the slower your weapon is, the more damage you gain per point of attack power. The very slow speed of Titansteel Spellblade, coupled with the inherent damage boost Fan of Knives gets with daggers, means Spellblade scales better with attack power than any other weapon in the game when talking about Fan of Knives damage. Felstriker is one most of you have probably heard of before. Normally, a 1.7 speed weapon would not be a good choice for Fan of Knives, but the insane power of the guaranteed critical strikes skyrockets this item to the top of the list. When fighting many enemies, each cast of Fan of Knives gives many chances to trigger Felstriker. This means the more enemies you're facing, the more reliably you'll be able to have this buff up. With guaranteed criticals, you'll gain a huge amount of energy back from your focused attacks talent. If you're interested in getting this dagger, I linked a video in the description about how to farm it. This dagger isn't quite as good for a combat rogue without the focused attacks talent. A lot of the power comes from the synergy of the critical strikes and focused attacks. Stormshroud's 3-piece bonus is another great thing to use in most circumstances. Fan of Knives hits each enemy twice, so each enemy is 2 chances to trigger this effect. When you're dealing 10 or 20 or even more 1,000 damage with each cast of Fan of Knives, even the insane stat loss from this level 50 crafted armor is worth taking in order to give you more energy to allow more casts of Fan of Knives. For some more in-depth coverage of the Fish spec, there is a whole video dedicated to it on my channel. That was made before the discovery of Titansteel Spellblade, but everything else about it is good. You can find this video linked in the description. The last thing I want to say about the Fish spec is a slight variation used for instance farming like Karazhan. For this purpose, we grab a few valuable defensive talents instead of some of the offensive talents, and usually change the glyphs around as well. This makes AoE farming low-level instances much easier. The final talent specialization I want to talk about is Mutilate plus Blade Flurry. Sticking with the animal theme, I call this Chicken spec. There are 2 variations of this talent specialization, and they are used for very different purposes. The first one, shown on screen here, is used for speedrunning. This is a halfway between the standard Assassination spec and the Fish spec. It's not the best at single target, nor is it the best at AoE, but in a speedrun setting, you don't have a lot of opportunities to swap specs. You can run the Chicken spec through a lot of bosses and trash, and put out big damage on both. There are plenty of sub 50 runs with and without spec swaps from world-class guilds. I don't think the answer is clear on what the best setup is for rogues in terms of spec and spec swaps in a speedrun setting. Personally, I use standard Assassination plus Chicken spec and have 5 planned swaps in a Naxxramas run. There's a variant of the Chicken spec that's used for boss parsing, specifically on bosses like Anubricon, Grand Widow Fairlena, and 4 Horsemen, where there are at least 2 targets that count towards your damage parse. Being able to dump Mutilates and Envenoms into a Blade Flurry hitting 2 relevant targets is extremely powerful, and with good setup and a little luck, you can do Blade Flurries for over 90,000 damage on those bosses. You'll still be categorized as Assassination as far as Warcraft logs is concerned, and that Blade Flurry damage will give you a substantial boost over other Assassination rogues who are using the standard Hunger for Blood spec on those bosses. I hope this video has been informative and helped you understand the different ways you can do the talents and glyphs for your rogue in different circumstances. Thank you for watching and have a nice day. Thanks for watching the Simonized Show. If you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button. Can't wait for more sweet videos? Links are on screen that you can watch right now. Be sure to join the Discord server and pop by on Twitch to catch me live. Links to both are in the video description. Thank you for watching and have a great day.